Nightingale is a survival game that came out about 2 weeks ago. After getting some more playtime in on the game, I said I would give a more detailed review, so here we are. I do want to say that I haven't fully completed the game yet, however I'm, as far as I'm aware, at the in-game content. So I'll be basing all of my thoughts and opinions on everything I've experienced up until then. I'll touch a bit on the in-game content, but I won't be able to go too in-depth, seeing as to how I haven't actually fully completed that section of the game yet. This video will also contain spoilers on bosses, however if you're trying to avoid seeing them, I'll give a warning before I talk about them. I also understand that Nightingale is still in early access and isn't claiming to be a quadruple A game, so a lot of the criticisms I have for the game could be potentially fixed or changed in the future. Kicking things off, let's start with the character creation, since that's where you start in the game itself. As I said in my first impressions video, the character creation is pretty good. It's not the most complex character creation I've ever seen, but it's not too basic either. My opinion on the character creation hasn't changed from what they were in my first impressions video. Moving past character creation, we're thrown into the world and the tutorial begins. Right out the gate, the audio design to this game is absolutely incredible. I said this as well in my first impressions video, and I can say that the audio design is amazing throughout the entirety of the game. The ambient music does a great job at immersing you into the area you're in. If there's threats nearby, the audio makes you feel that threat's presence. I cannot give this game enough praise on its audio design. Speaking of audio design, let's move on to voice acting. In the previous video I made on Nightingale, I mentioned that I had only come across one character who was fully voice acted, that character being Puck, who is essentially your guide throughout the game. The voice acting that is in the game is pretty solid. I wouldn't say it's the best I've ever heard, but it's by no means bad. Previously, I had mentioned that I hoped to see more characters with voice acted lines once early access had released, and unfortunately, at the moment, Puck is the only voice acted character. Every other character you'll meet, whether they're essential characters for the story or not, do not have voice acted lines. Instead, you'll have to read the dialogue if you want to follow the story, but you'll have to be doing a lot of reading if you do want to follow it. Nightingale does have a story and lore, however it's not something you have to keep up with in order to enjoy the game. Personally, I was really interested in the story, but after having to read what felt like a book's worth of text, I ended up just skipping the dialogue, which ended up in me not knowing what was really going on in the story. From what I did grasp of the story, it seemed very compelling and I wanted to follow along with it. Honestly, if the characters that were related to the story had voice acted lines, I would have followed along with it. However, Nightingale currently doesn't have that, so if you're like me and don't want to read the entire story unfold and would rather it be told to you, at the moment that's just not an option. Hopefully in the future they do add more voice acting. Personally, I find it boring and less impactful if I have to read to follow along with the main plotline. Good voice acting can dramatically improve the quality and impact of the story. I know Nightingale isn't necessarily trying to be story driven since it is a survival game at the end of the day. However, it seems like they've put in a decent amount of time into crafting a story. I just think it'll mostly go unnoticed due to the lack of voice acting from story related characters. Moving on from the lack of voice acted characters, let me focus on the one who is. The voice acting for Puck is, again, pretty good. It's not the best I've ever heard, but it's also not bad either. However, the writing for the character is at times extremely hard to follow and understand exactly what he's trying to tell you. I get it's part of his character to kind of speak in riddles, however, if he's supposed to be your guide throughout the game, understanding what I'm supposed to do gets lost in translation between the riddles and words and I'm sure majority of players have never even heard before. With Puck trying to guide me and point me in the direction of progression, instead of teaching me the fundamentals and basics of the game, the character instead does a better job at making me feel dumb because I have no clue what they're talking about. Speaking of understanding what you're supposed to do, let's look a bit at how this game encourages your progression. In Nightingale, you're pointed forward through both Puck and quests or objectives. However, a lot of the time, especially right after you complete the tutorial, it gets very confusing on what you need to do to actually progress. Some games hold your hand too much, and others kind of just make you figure it out. Nightingale is at a weird middle ground where it tries to point you towards progression, but at the same time does a horrible job at it and leaves you more confused than anything. Countless times I had no idea what I was supposed to do in order to progress. Certain items or gear would be locked and I wasn't able to craft it even though I had all the workbenches to build it, and there was no crafting recipe to learn or buy from an essence trader. Hopefully this system gets improved on because as it stands right now, the game is not very user friendly when it comes to figuring out how to progress throughout the game. Moving away from progression, let's take a look at the AI. In my first impressions video, I mentioned that the AI needed reworked really badly due to the fact that companions and enemy AI was just too easy to break. To avoid most enemy attacks, all you have to do is walk in a circle and most times you'll be able to avoid getting hit. Companions also aren't the most useful either. If you want to rely on your companions to gather resources for you or help you fight in combat, you'll quickly realize that they're very limited in how useful they actually are. When it comes to resource gathering, they'll only harvest resources that are very close to you, and if you give your companion both a pickaxe and an axe, expecting them to switch between the two as needed, you'll quickly realize they don't switch their equipped items on their own. Instead, you have to manually make them equip one or the other. So if you're near a bunch of trees but they currently have their pickaxe equipped, even though there's an axe in their inventory, you'll still have to make them equip it just for them to start cutting down trees around you. Otherwise, they'll just stand around doing next to nothing. They'll try to pick up any items on the ground, but they'll mostly just stand around doing nothing. Companions can also help you fight in combat, however their help isn't so much with actually attacking enemies, but more so just being bait for them. The companions will attack enemies, however a lot of the time they just somehow miss their attacks and end up just being a punching bag while you finish off the enemy since they're not all targeting you. Companions become less of a useful resource for both combat and resource gathering, and more of a portable backpack and meat shield. Personally, I think the AI in Nightingale needs a lot of extra attention because as it stands right now, it's not that great and feels more clunky than anything. Moving past the AI, let's focus on the combat. Combat in Nightingale is okay at best. Like most survival games, the combat isn't the most interesting part about the game, and mostly results in either shooting enemies from a distance or repeatedly hitting them with your melee weapon without ever really needing to dodge or block. However, you are able to land headshots and even heart shots to do extra damage, and both feel very satisfying to do. Moving a bit further into combat, let's take a look at some of the bosses you'll encounter. I am about to show some bosses for reference, so if you're trying to avoid seeing them, here is your spoiler warning. Skip to the time on screen to avoid it. Some boss fights in Nightingale are really good and challenging, and others are pretty underwhelming. For example, most of the bosses you'll fight in the Sights of Power, minus maybe the last two, are underwhelming and not that challenging. They don't need to be on the level of a Souls-like boss fight. However, if I'm able to avoid basically every attack in the fight by just running in a circle, then I have a hard time really calling that a boss fight. All of the bosses in the Sights of Power are basically the same thing, with each one getting somewhat harder than the last. The last two actually felt like they deserved the title of a boss fight, but that's only because you end up fighting two bosses at the same time. However, the Sights of Power aren't the only places where you'll encounter bosses. You can also come across them in certain realms where you can either choose to fight them for the items they drop, or make an offering to them for those items to avoid the fight. Personally, I chose to fight them every time because I wanted to experience what the fight was like, rather than giving them some of my resources and missing out on it. As of right now, there are currently 3 different bosses that appear in the realms. There's the Automaton Bishop, the Sun Giant, and the Elder Eoten. I'm assuming that's how you say this thing's name. Starting with the Bishop, it's basically the same thing as the bosses from the Sights of Power, except it almost always has minions around it to make things a bit more interesting. In one of the later boss fights in the Sights of Power, these minions are there too, however not nearly as many. Honestly, fighting the Bishop isn't difficult, but the added minions makes it more challenging. For a boss fight, it's not bad by any means, but it's also nothing that will blow you away, especially since it's so similar to the Sights of Power boss fights. Moving on to the Sun Giant, I can confidently say that this was the most fun and challenging boss I have come across so far. The Sun Giant has quite a few different attacks they can do, and it honestly requires you to be pretty quick with your reactions to what it's doing. Also, the AI for the Sun Giant was by far the best in the game so far. There's an attack it does where it'll shoot these laser orb things at you, and depending on what you're doing, it'll try to lead its shots to hit you rather than just shooting where you're currently at. Fighting the Sun Giant was by far the hardest boss I had come across, and was also the most fun I had going against any of the bosses. Finally, moving on to the Elder Eoten, again, I'm not sure how to pronounce this thing's name. This fight was really cool at first, however for me it just ended up getting stuck throughout majority of the fight and wouldn't fight back. I'm not sure if this is because of the area I was in, if it's a known issue, or if mine was simply just bugged. The way this boss fight starts is one of the best out of the 3 in my opinion. Wandering through the forest and suddenly a massive tree hoists itself out of the ground prepared to fight is not only terrifying but also feels like something straight out of a movie. I can't really comment much on how well this boss fight plays out due to mine being a pacifist and refusing to fight back, so I don't know if this is actually a good boss fight like the Sun Giant or if it falls more along the lines of the Sights of Power bosses. Moving past the bosses, I feel like I've spoken a lot about what I feel needs improvement in the game so far and not so much about what the game currently does right. So to somewhat balance out the issues I have with the game so far, I'm going to talk about what I do like. Exploration in Nightingale is really well done. You're put into this small area that's created based off of the cards you play, so you can make the area you're currently in have very little or a lot of hostile creatures, make it permanently day or night, make it to where there's more or rarer resources to harvest, etc. You use these cards to travel from realm to realm to get more gear for better resources. I personally really like this system, and it makes the game feel much more endless rather than just being stuck on one singular map throughout the entirety of the game. The art style and overall theme of the game is also something I really enjoy. It's a mix of like a steampunk and magical sort of vibe, and it just meshes so well together and really makes it stand out. The way the end game, or at least I'm assuming is the end game, is also something that's very unique for survival games, and I'm honestly really enjoying the idea and concept behind it. I am about to go over what I believe is the end game content, so if you're trying to avoid seeing anything that is end game related, this is your spoiler warning. Skip to the time on screen to avoid it. The way the end game works is you're brought to what is essentially a hub for players where you'll then be able to take on much more powerful bosses called apex creatures. At the time of recording this, I believe there's only 3 apex creatures creatures, and so far I've only fought one of the 3. Essentially, the way the endgame works is you're supposed to go to Ascended Realms, which are just harder versions of the realms you've already visited that lead you to where you currently are. In these realms, you'll collect tier 3 essence, which is like the game's currency in a sense. You'll use this tier 3 essence to upgrade your gear to the highest you possibly can to be able to take down the apex creatures easier. However, you're not necessarily forced to do this grind if you don't really want to. Of course, fighting the apex creatures will be extremely difficult if you choose not to, but since several players can fight the apex creatures at the same time, you could rely more on other players to quickly take out enemies if you wanted. Not forcing players into this grind is such an interesting approach and works really well. You can either do the grind and increase your gear, or you can skip the grind and work more with other players. Final spoiler warning, I'm about to talk about the apex creature I fought and show some examples of it, so if you want to avoid it, skip to the time on screen. The apex creature that I fought, it was basically just a bigger, badder version of the Elder Eoten. It had more health, did more damage, and this time actually fought back because there wasn't anything for it to get stuck on. I don't know if it does the same attacks or not because again, the first one I fought was against violence and never really fought back. If any of you have fought both versions, let me know down below if they have the same attacks or not. Fighting this apex creature wasn't overly complicated. It had a few interesting attacks where it would trap you in a circle of thorns and damage you until you got out of them, but for the most part, it wasn't anything on the level of the Sun Giant. I did end up dying in this fight, however, I was also severely unprepared, and another player ended up carrying my girlfriend and I throughout basically the entire battle. As of right now, this is the furthest I've gotten in the game, and I'm not sure if there's actually anything after beating all of the apex creatures. I can see it both being the end of the game currently, but can also see ways there is more content after this. If any of you have beaten all of the apex creatures, be sure to let me know if there's actually anything else that happens after beating them. On the technical side of things, the game ran pretty smoothly. I do have a pretty beefy PC, but I didn't experience very many frame drops, and the game ran on mostly high settings the entire time I was playing. I never experienced a crash, however load times were sometimes pretty slow, most likely due to the game being online only at the moment. You do have to have an internet connection in order to play the game at all. Currently there is no offline mode, however the devs have explained the reasoning behind this and are also currently working on an offline mode. According to the devs, the reason Nightingale doesn't currently have an offline mode is because in order for them to reach their deadline for early access launch, they were faced with the issue of either supporting co-op at launch or having the game be single player only. They decided that supporting co-op at launch was the route they wanted to go because it was a harder system to develop and they wanted to allow players to be able to play with each other from the very beginning. Unfortunately, this resulted in no offline mode at launch, however one is currently being worked on. As of right now, there is no estimate on when an offline mode will be added, but it has at least been confirmed that it is coming sometime in the future. As it stands, Nightingale has some really solid foundation and has the potential to become an absolutely incredible game. The game desperately needs some improvements in some areas, however there isn't anything in the game that I think shouldn't be there at all. Everything in Nightingale seems to have a purpose and with a lot of thought and effort behind each part of it. Personally, I think certain aspects just need a little more attention to really make this game great. Do I recommend you buy Nightingale? If you're open to dealing with a game that's not very user-friendly at times, experiencing bugs, and it seems like something you're interested in, I'd say go for it. If you're still on the fence, I'd recommend waiting a few months for the devs to be able to fine-tune the game a bit more. I'm curious to know, what are your thoughts on Nightingale? Is it living up to your expectations? I'm still pretty new to doing reviews on games, so let me know how I did down below. If you'd like to see me review more games, make sure to leave a like and subscribe so you never miss a video.